campers! Welcome to the world according to, well, me. As perpetually is the case, I am your host, Yoni Martin, and I'm glad you could join me today. Let me tell you, it is hot as hell out there. So if I look a little disarrayed to those of you watching on video, that's why. And if you're listening on the podcast, it doesn't matter how I look. Anyway, as some of you may remember, when last we spoke, my guest, Steve Stoliar, the author of Raised Eyebrows, My Years Inside Groucho's House, was my guest. And of course, as often happens, when I'm talking to somebody like Steve, we just went on and on, so I had to break it up into two parts. This first part the first part was done last week, and you may remember, if you've listened to it or seen it, that we ended with a story about his appearance on the Dick Cavett show and how that went. And I may put a little bit of that in, but that's where we left off, so we're going to pick it up from there for part two. I should warn you, something glitched at the end of the video for our conversation, but all that was cut off was our saying goodbye to each other, which we do on a frequent basis these days. So don't worry about that. You're not going to miss anything or anything important other than Steve and me saying goodbye. And that's pretty much it. So, without further ado, I give you part two of my conversation with Steve Stoliar. Well, we can't, as the wonderful thing about your stories, and your time with Groucho is how many other people you met and got to.
The Cavett connection was an interesting one. You held up that paperback of Cavett's book.
Right. I set you up for that one.
I walked right into your trap.
You did.
Kevin McCarthy and Nancy Pelosi.
Oh, no. I like yours better.
The book came out in 1974. And Groucho got an advance copy because he had given a Dust Jacket blurb about how great Cavett and the book are. And the only other Dust Jacket blurb on the Dust Jacket was Woody Allen, which was rare. So Woody and Groucho were endorsing the Cavett book. So I was in my office at Groucho's house, and Groucho came shuffling down the hall with the book. And he handed it to me and he said, "Read this, you'll enjoy it." Basically as a command, but it was gratifying that he thought, I'll bet Steve would enjoy this. How do you even think about it? So at the time, I appreciated Cavett as sort of the thinking man's Carson. I didn't make a point of watching his show, but I did see it from time to time and like it. I thought it was kind of nervy that he had published his memoirs while still in his 30s. But I thought I better read this because Groucho's going to say, "Well, what'd you think of it?" I don't want to say, "I didn't bother." Here, take it back. So I took it home. And from the first page, I just related to this guy. It's like, man, we're on the same wavelength. We see everything the same way. Similar backgrounds. I'm from St. Louis. He was from Nebraska. We both lost our mothers to cancer at an early age and had that adjustment of, do you introduce your stepmother as your stepmother because it sounds like you're making a point of it? Or do you introduce her as your mother and you're betraying your real dead mother? Being nervous around girls and worshipful of that group of comedians from radio and vaudeville, Benny and Groucho and Hope. And I'm just reading this thinking, I bet if we ever met, we would hit it off. But what are the chances? He's this guy that went to Yale and lives in New York, one of those Manhattan snobs. And I'm this kid in tennis shoes that lives in Tarzan and goes to UCLA. But in the course of reading the book, Cabot talks about the day he met Groucho, which was at George Kaufman's funeral.
Yep.
And they on the next day, they spent time together, and Groucho said a bunch of stuff to Cabot. And when Cabot got home, he jotted down key words to remind him of the funny stories Groucho told. And in the book, Cabot says, I still have those scraps of paper, but to my frustration, I don't know what some of them mean. And he mentioned a couple of them in the book. And I thought they sounded familiar because of my exposure to Groucho. So I stole Cabot's address out of Groucho's black book and wrote him a letter saying, I work for Groucho, and he gave me a copy of the book. And here is what I think those two references are. And I mailed it to him, and I got a letter back that said, Dear Steve, you were uncannily on the nose with your two guesses. This in haste as I must get to the airport. Write again, and I'll answer again and better. Yours, Dick. And that was the beginning of what is now a 40-something year friendship. When I wrote Raised Eyebrows, it wasn't lost on me that the introduction and one of the dust jacket blurbs was from Dick Cabot, the guy who had given a dust jacket blurb to Cabot for his book. And I've written a book on Groucho, and Cabot wrote that. And I got a blurb from Woody Allen, who said it was one of the best books about a show business icon he'd ever read. So here are the people here. I've written a book about the guy who had given a blurb with, it's like these three people cycling through. And then in Cabot's subsequent books, he's mentioned me a few times. So it's weird for me to read about myself in the context of my work with Groucho and Raised Eyebrows, that now I'm in Dick Cabot's books, and it all started from Groucho saying, here, read this, you'll enjoy it. And Dick's the one who hired me to be a writer when I was a production secretary at Universal. He had faith in me, and I moved to New York and spent a splendiferous 2.5 years writing for him and just soaking in the whole Manhattan experience.
So you could become a New York snob too.
I did. And when I had to come back here, unfortunately, because work dried up there and I was offered a staff job that paid a lot of money. It's like, gee, do I want to temp it as a secretary in New York, or do I want to be paid thousands of dollars a week? So there was no decision to be made, but I was very sorry. It's like I came very close to working on the Letterman show. They had a position. This was
the morning show?
No, but it was late night in 86. It was just a couple of years into his nighttime show. And I met him and Jack Rollins, who was his manager, as well as Woody's and Cabot's and Nichols and May. And the producer, Barry Sand. And it turns out that they ended up not hiring someone. They ended up expanding the duties of someone already on staff. It was mostly about, it wasn't quite writing, but it also wasn't just busy work. It was looking through newspapers from all over the country to find stories that could lend themselves to bits on the show, that would have satisfied my creative thing, but also to be a part of the Letterman show and its halcyon. I mean, it was hot then.
Oh yeah.
So they didn't, and it would have been, I think, $750 a week, which would have kept me in New York. But instead, they broke the news to me just as I got that other offer. I would have turned down the LA job to stay in New York, but I couldn't. So I rolled back into California. But yes, I've been trying to pass myself off as a transplanted New Yorker just from the 2.5 years I spent there.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, as a native New Yorker, very few native New Yorkers can afford to live in New York anymore.
Yeah.
My friend Mike DiGaetano, who went out to LA and for many years was doing television as a producer, writer, decided he wanted to leave and come back to New York and write for the Broadway stage, which he did. And then, of course, COVID hit. He's got 2 musicals and I think 3 plays he's written. And
how it's like if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? If you've written a great play and there's no one to hear it performed, does it exist?
Yeah, well, he's still surviving, I think, on his residuals and from LA.
You know, for all the film work that Marshall Brickman did, you know, co-writing Sleeper and Manhattan and Annie Hall and all that, Woody said writing the adaptation of the Jersey Boys has ended up generating more money for Brickman than all the money Woody's made as a filmmaker in his entire career. And wow. Brickman didn't want to do it. He was thinking, I don't want to write about the Four Seasons. What else is out there? And so reluctantly, he accepted the gig. And of course, it became fabulously successful.
Yeah.
And so money just kept pouring into Brickman's pockets because he happened to have hit on a nugget of gold. So you never know.
I'm going out of sync here, but you brought up something that had been bothering me for years. For years. No, I didn't know anybody else felt as insane as I did until I read your book. I was never a big fan of Lucille Ball's. But when she and Groucho did the Emmys together, and I saw her push him out of the way, I went out of my mind, and I have loathed her since. I have never forgotten that. And I didn't know that until I read your book, that it had become a big thing for a lot of people who saw that. So you're
going to write a book called I Loathe Lucy?
Ooh. Damn, yes, I wish I'd come up with that one.
There was some fan that wrote saying something like, he wrote a letter to Groucho and said, I was so outraged at the way she treated you that I sent her a letter that said, if you learn to stand on your head and spit wooden nickels, I wouldn't pay dime one to see you. That has stayed with me.
I like that.
5 years. I also remember when the producer of the show came over to run through the material with Groucho, and he said, we're going to have to stick to the script because there isn't a lot of time and we're going to be tight. And Groucho said, I know Lucy will be. And then the guy said, anyway, we go live. And Groucho said, live? Yeah, and you'll have to get someone else. Dark self. Well, but in fact, he was right. Lucy was Tank, a frequent occurrence. And so when the name of the winner, they had it on the You Bet Your Life Duck came down, Groucho was supposed to read it. And so she read the nominees and then grabbed the envelope out of Groucho's hand and read the winner. So he was essentially an extra in this bit with the two of them. But, you know, I've heard all sorts of things about her that aren't flattering.
Yeah,
and
so have I.
It makes, you know, it doesn't take away from the I Love Lucy, which I adored when I was a kid and which continues to be fabulously popular in syndication. But one of the interesting things about her is I have heard from several people firsthand, people who knew her or worked with her, that she didn't really have a sense of humor.
I've heard the same thing.
People don't understand that. And it's like she could perform physical comedy well, but she wasn't a clever or witty person and didn't really appreciate or understand verbal wordplay. She wasn't a humorous person, but she could perform comedy well. And Cabot told me, he said, I performed an unofficial poll among stewardesses. And it was as if they had all conspired ahead of time to say, if Dick Cabot ever asks you this question, give this answer. I would say, of all the celebrities you've ever waited on, who was the absolute, but Lucille Ball. He said, I've never been able to finish asking the question. And they can't wait to unload about, and apparently it's a haughtiness and an arrogance. The stewardess would say, would you like a martini? And she would turn to Gary Morton, her husband, and say, tell her I want, she would say, can I get you something to drink? And Lucy would turn to Gary and say, tell her I want a martini. Miss Ball would like a martini. And the stewardess would say, did you want vodka or gin? Tell her I want a gin martini very dry. Miss Ball would like a gin martini very dry. She wouldn't talk to the little people.
Yeah, that's.
Even an intimate thing of a airline cabin. And I've heard other similar things about that.
By the way, that was a good caveat you did. That was
not the Lucille book.
No, but the caveat was great.
Oh, thank you. Tell her I want a gin. My voice isn't this low. I can't get it. I don't chain smoke, so I can't get it.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, people don't like to hear that because they love Lucy and they want to believe that also apparently Danny Kaye he enchanted millions of children. I loved him when I was 7.
So did I.
Just a dynamo of singing and comedy and those tongue twisting patter songs he did and dancing and all this. And I am hard pressed to find anyone that worked with him that feels like saying, let me tell you what a favor he did me. Let me tell you what a mensch he was. It's always the opposite, just ego and mean-spirited. And there are others like Harpo and Jack Benny and Jack Lemmon for whom you cannot, no matter how deeply you dig, find someone saying, let me tell you what a shit this guy was. So, and bringing up Lemmon, at one of Groucho's birthday parties, I was overhearing Jack Lemmon talking with Groucho's son, Bill. And Bill said, I've met a lot of jerks and mean-spirited people in show business. I have to tell you, you are a genuinely nice guy. And Lemmon said, well, thanks, Bill, but there's really no reason not to. And at the time, I just thought it was a polite, gracious response. But the more I thought about it in subsequent years, he's right. There's no reason not to be a nice guy. It's sort of the glass half full thing. I tend to trust people until they betray me. There's other people who won't trust someone till they earn the trust. And I guess partly as a protective thing, there's the people with the egos that cause them to be arrogant and mean-spirited and pushy and bullying. And I don't think you realize who I am. And I want a table at this restaurant. I won 2 Oscars. And here's Lemmon, who is, really one of the greats, equally adept at comedy and drama, multiple Oscar winner, just universally. And he was able to go through life not having to be a jerk or mistreat people and still be very successful. So
my wife worked with him when she lived in LA. She had a little bit nothing part. I don't even remember what it was, but
what movie?
I can't remember.
What
Shoot,
year-ish?
it was a small thing, but the thing I remember is my wife was talking about how nice he was, how he'd come over and he just start a conversation. She was nothing,
Right.
As Hollywood goes.
Right.
And he just start a conversation and he actually show interest in her and as a person. And it stuck with her all these years. And I love hearing stories like that about people I admire because.
You know who Brent Spiner is? Was on Star Trek Next Generation.
Of course.
We became friendly a few years ago and remain in touch. And he worked on a film called Out to Sea with Lemon and Mathau that Martha Coolidge directed. He was very good. He played an unctuous cruise director and was really good. He's a very good actor. And one of the other supporting players in the film was Donald O'Connor. And there was a break in filming, and Donald O'Connor came by Brent Spiner's dressing room and knocked on the door. And he said, I have a reel that has all of my dance solos from all my Hollywood movies. Would you like to watch it with me? And Brett said, yes, absolutely. And they spent all this time, and O'Connor's explaining to him things that happened during the shooting, how they came up with the idea, problems that there were, funny things that happened. Now you could say, oh, well, that was his ego needed soothing or something. But man, imagine that. Here is this legendary dancer, entertainer saying, I have this thing. Can I interest you in showing it to you? And yeah, so there are those stories,
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's for me to hear a story like that about Donald O'Connor, who I've loved my whole life. That's phenomenal.
And so at Groucho's, as a rule, not black and white, but as a rule, Groucho's friends, the legendary people, were much more comfortable and down to earth, even though they had a right to be, could have been arrogant if they wanted. And it was the younger, just made it people that had the ego thing. It's a bit like George Burns with Salt of the Earth. And it was interesting that these guys that are true, enduring legends were much less pretentious than people who had recently had a hit.
Bob Hope maybe being an exception, especially if you worked for him.
I guess, although the people who worked for him for decades and have an affection for him. I interacted with him several times in my life under different circumstances. The last one being really wonderful. It was when Dick Cavett was out here to interview him, and I got to spend an afternoon at Hope's house in Toluca Lake. And he was, relaxed and down to earth and conversational and really pleasant. And I told him about something that happened in World War II that my dad had attended a USO show. And he had his dog in his lap. And he was sitting near the stage, and the dog jumped out of his lap and ran across the stage. And Hope said, say you better grab that before Crosby puts a saddle across it. Because Crosby was into racehorses, and dogs were nicknames for racehorses that weren't any good. So this was so surreal. I told Hope that story, and he cracked up and said, did I say that? Isn't that something? And it was so weird to be able to tell this back 50 years later to the guy that had said it in Darmstadt, Germany in 45.
Wow.
Anyway, that was really pleasant. And then when he came to Groucho's 85th birthday party, that was fun. But I also saw a dark side of him when he was taping a segment of Joys that Groucho was on, and he laid into his hairdressing guy in front of the cast and crew. And it's like, man, you would not want to be on the receiving end of a tongue. What's the matter with you? Look at that. Do you even know what you're doing? Look at my hair. How could you let it be? You know, and at that point, Hope's hair, you know, it was like comb over and spray paint and, you know, get rid of the shine with more tar or whatever they slathered on there. So, you know, I think he probably needed to yell at Father Time or himself more than the hairdresser, who probably went to heroic ends to keep Hope looking as good as he could look in his mid-70s.
Amazing. I think based on my interaction with Bill Marx, Harpo had that same thing. I can't remember if it's in Harpo's autobiography or if Bill just told me, but they Harpo loved pulling pranks on Groucho. One time he called him up and he said, "Oh, hang on a second." And he calls Bill and says, "Come on." And they drove over to Groucho's house and they're looking in the window and Groucho's sitting there with the phone and he's steaming. He's waiting. He's still waiting. And of course, Harpo's in the window going,
That's like the image I had that I was going to be at Groucho's while Aaron Fleming was still on the phone explaining my job to me. Life imitates art, imitates life.
Well,
I'm sorry I never got to meet Harpo because, again, he just sounds like such a wonderful person.
yeah. Well, I mean, Bill's affection for him was so obvious, and for the whole family. I mean, that was probably, I guess, the most successful marriage.
Harpo was married once. They stayed married their entire lives. I didn't hear about Harpo womanizing. I didn't hear that it was ever on the verge of divorce or something like that.
No.
The children didn't end up in institutions or rehab,
or hating their father.
Yeah, it does happen.
It's sad, but it's, I mean, I give Erin Fleming one thing. She did have one of the best lines in Everything You Want to Know About Sex, but were afraid to ask. I went to NYU.
Well, but you're crediting her with something Woody Allen.
That Woody Allen wrote. Yeah, I know. But she delivered it well, and it got one of the great laughs in that movie. So I'm trying to find the positive from the outside.
Oh, no, there are positive things. She came along at a time when Groucho's children weren't interested in looking after him. And Groucho was just kind of bored in semi-retirement. And she picked him up and dusted him off and arranged for the one-man shows where thousands of people stood up and gave him standing ovations and laughed, which, fed his ego. She helped him go out a bigger legend than he might have on his own. Although I'm also quick to add, she isn't credited with generating the renewed interest in Groucho and the Marx Brothers, because that was already underway in the mid-'60s from the whole counterculture hippie crowd that discovered them and loved the anti-establishment, thumbing your nose at the authorities, anarchy of the Marx Brothers, especially their Paramount films.
Absolutely.
So they had been, and Cabot had Groucho on, and Groucho would make references to things from the movies, and the audience would go crazy. So they were already primed for worshiping Groucho. But Aaron did help she didn't generate the wave, but she helped Groucho ride that wave. And he enjoyed being hot again, even though his longtime friends were thinking he's really not in good enough shape to be doing this. I wish he would just kind of quietly live out his last years in comfort and not under the harsh glare of the spotlight. So again, it's not a black and white thing, because he loved the attention, even if people were thinking, why does he still need to go out and do these things?
I want to ask you a question, because there's a book about Groucho, The Comedy of Existence, by Lee Siegel, that really, from what I read, is have you read the book? Because it's...
No, I've read about it enough to know that I probably won't be reading it, because I have a very low tolerance for analysis and deep thinking about things that don't really lend themselves to it. And from what I read, there's just so much, I ran into this in film school at UCLA, the symbolism. What does this represent? What is, are the people that try to salute duck soup as a subtle, wry satire on the futility of war. No one connected with the film had that in mind. If you see it now and find that it points up the futility of war, that's fine. But do not say, oh, it was the year that Hitler came to power and the Marx Brothers did this wry satire on the future. No, they didn't. It's like the year before, Groucho was the head of a college. What would be another funny setting? Well, Paramount had just done $1 Million Legs with W.C. Fields as the president of Klopstokia, a mythical European country. Let's make Groucho the head of Fredonia and play off of all that. But, Joe Adamson interviewed Leo McCarey, who directed it, and McCarey was adamant. He said, no, we did not set out to do an anti-war satire. I know that kids today look at it and think that. It's like it deserves all sorts of praise, but it doesn't deserve that. And I read about, like, in King Kong, I hear that, when the giant log slides across the gate to close the logs to keep Kong away, it's phallic. You see, the latch it's meant to be a giant penis because Kong is huge. And it's like, no, you have, that's how you close a cabin door. Here's a story that's pertinent. John Ford, venerable director John Ford. This was told to me by one of my college professors who, a couple of years before I was at UCLA, had hosted Ford it was a screening of The Searchers and then a Q&A afterwards with the film students. Bob Epstein was the guy, he's a great teacher. So the movie runs, and afterwards the lights come up and Bob is sitting at a table with John Ford, and they have a couple of microphones and they take questions. And this one kid raises his hand and said, Mr. Ford, I've noticed that in a lot of your films, you have fences. And I was wondering if the fences are meant to represent how man physically separates himself from nature or from his fellow man, whether he's isolating himself. What are the fences meant to represent? And Ford leaned into the microphone and said, son, I make Westerns, and out west they have ranches, and if you don't have fences, the cows walk away. I love that story because I run into so many variations of that with people saying, oh, well, you know what he was trying to say here. Oh, you know what they were, or Groucho is an evolution of the stereotypical stingy Jew, and all these, and it's the European influence of it, and it's just
pretentious analysis.
Yes, and Groucho would alternate between being amused and annoyed by it, but he had the original pen and ink of a William Hamilton New Yorker cartoon on the front entrance of his house, and I might have it in the book, but I can't remember the actual caption. But it was a college professor talking to a bunch of students, and it says something like, "But the tautology of their theology reaches its zenith in duck soup," something like that. And it's just about the pretentious. It's like, oh, here's a college course, which would have been really rare. Now there probably are college courses where they dissect the work of a director or something. Not in this was probably original cartoon was probably like 71 maybe. And Groucho had it there, not because he was proud to be referenced, but to say, isn't it stupid that they read this shit in our old movie? We were just trying to be funny, and they succeeded.
Well, it's like the scene in Annie Hall with Woody Allen in Diane Keaton in line for the film, and the guy behind him.
My work. He originally wanted Orson Welles for that, but he wasn't available, and they were going to talk about Citizen Kane. But I think it's better because Welles was much more visible, and it was a more.
Marshall McLuhan was great. I love that.
You understand nothing of my work and writing.
So, let's see. I'm thinking all the things in your book that.
Well, we just can't begin to do all of that.
I know, but Mae West, come on. The fact that she was as teeny as
4'11".
Yeah.
I mean, you shrink somewhat when you're older, but it wasn't like she was 6 feet tall and lost a foot,
Yeah.
But she was such an imposing screen presence. I think if you look up how tall was Mae West, it says 5 feet even in the 30s. So she only lost an inch. But
so 5 feet by 5 feet.
That's right.
Oh my! But you said she was beautiful even then.
Did I?
Yeah, you did. You said she was pretty hot.
She was very pale. Had a pile of suspiciously blonde hair on top of her head. A white pantsuit, and she had problems with depth perception, so she needed a little assistance walking. But otherwise, she was intact. Mae West had sent a letter to Groucho, and she said, I was thinking about how when I was waiting to see the rushes of my pictures, we'd look at rushes from your brother's movies and how funny they were. Cool moment. So Groucho invited her to come up and see him
sometime. Yeah.
And, he wasn't starstruck. It didn't mean a lot to him. Ooh, Mae West is coming over. He was Groucho Marx. So,
yeah.
Erin was kind of intimidated, and she was very concerned. It's like, let's get the house clean. Let's put out the good silver. Let's make sure this and that. And she wanted everything to be perfect. And she made the mistake of saying to Groucho, don't say anything that might be embarrassing, which is like telling a kid, don't touch the wet paint sign.
Yeah.
Don't go through the door. Cava told me he was in an office once, and he was just about going through an office door, and the secretary said, you can't go in there. And he said, well, of course I can. You see, there's this rectangular thing that's cut into the wall with 2 hinges and a doorknob. Anyway, so yeah, Cabot likes to be the naughty boy who touches the wet, hot thing. Two of the things that were known about Mae West, one was that she had been arrested and jailed in the 20s
Sex.
because of her play Sex.
Yep.
Gee, I can't imagine why in the early 20s a play called Sex, written by and starring Mae West, might have ruffled any feathers. So she had, in fact, been jailed, although I think she ended up finding it a plus because it caused more people to want to see what all the fuss was about.
I'm sure.
One of the other things was that when she made My Little Chickadee, she and W.C. Fields hated each other.
Oh,
I think it was two huge egos battling for, who's going to get the ultimate punchline in this scene. How many lines did you get in this scene? I wrote my lines to go this way. And they just couldn't stand each other. Some of the producers thought, this is great. We'll put together these two legends and they'll spark off each other. And it isn't a bad movie. It isn't either of their best films, but it's certainly enjoyable.
Yeah, but the stories are legendary.
She would talk to him on the set. She would write down a note and give it to a crew member and give this to Bill Fields. So the night arrives, and I'm lucky to be in attendance. And the doorbell rings, and in comes tiny, unmistakable Mae West with Paul Novak, who was sort of he had been one of the muscle men in her 50s Vegas act, and then ended up being her caretaker, Aaron Fleming, but not abusive, factotum. Anyway, and the first thing Groucho says is, "What do you hear from Bill Fields?" And Aaron is dying, and Mae West says, "In your dreams, Groucho, in your dreams." And then a couple minutes later, he said, "Didn't they throw you in the pokey once?" And Aaron and Mae West said, "Yeah, but I always managed to wiggle out of tight situations like that." And she did her wiggle, and I'm thinking, I don't believe I'm witnessing this. Here are the king and queen of Paramount's early comedies, and she's playing off of the stuff that Groucho's saying while Aaron is just dying. And then they were trying to coax her into singing, and she said, I don't have my records. She didn't have her backing vocals. But she said, I could do some reciting if you like. So she steadies herself at the baby grand piano that Groucho had basically stolen from NBC. It was a rehearsal piano for all the musical stuff they did on You Bet Your Life that NBC lent, and he never got around to returning. So that was the piano. And Bill Marx, Harpo's son, great pianist and composer, was at the piano, and he started playing this honky-tonk version of Frankie and Johnny, while Mae West is standing there with one hand on the piano and one on her hip, and we're hearing ding 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 ding. And she started reciting this poem called Pleasure Man, which she had written. And it was all about these lovers, and it was about sex, and it rhymed, and it was clever. And it was just this remarkable moment. It's like it wasn't singing, it was reciting poetry with Frankie and Johnny playing and Mae West by the piano. And she signed a book for me, and she signed it to Steve, Sin-Searly. She made a point of separating the sin from the Searly. So.
And you wonder why people hate you, Steve. I mean.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to have to toddle.
Okay.
But we can perhaps do something else another time.
Well, as it is, I think we probably have a two-parter here because we've been going on for almost 2 hours now.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, you miss the Louis Stadlin full 2 hours by a few minutes, but you come close. And there's an irony in that.
I met Louis at Musso and Frank. That we had a mutual friend. And so, well, I met him once briefly at Groucho's, but that was just a fleeting thing. And I had been told ahead of time by our mutual friend that Louis has had a favorable opinion of Aaron because he saw the side of her that many people saw, which was this attentive, doting person that Groucho's spirits would come up when she'd be around. He wasn't there every day and in the later years to see what happened. So I wasn't going to bring it up because I didn't want to spar or say, here's why you're, I wanted to be a decent guy. But Stadlin brought it up, and he said he hadn't read my book. And he said, let me know what you think of this. I think Aaron got a rotten deal from the press. I think it was Arthur, a money grab from Arthur, and slandering her. And she got a really rotten deal because she was really good for Groucho. Is that pretty much the way you see it? And I went, no. And he laughed. And I very judiciously, diplomatically explained a bit about my experience, which intrigued him. And then I had a copy of my book in the trunk of my car, and I ran out and inscribed it. I went to the bar and asked the guy for a pen. I said something about having to go to the bathroom, but I actually went and got him a copy of the book and signed it and handed it to him. And I think he has now a more sculpted view of Aaron. It doesn't take away his firsthand memories, but he sees that there was more to the story and that it wasn't just, gee, what a great woman, and here Arthur was being this bully trying to...
Well, I think Lewis is probably a little bit prejudiced because I don't think he enjoyed Arthur's participation in Minnie's Boys. So that may be part of what was going on there.
And there's a wonderful letter that S.J. Perelman wrote to Nunnally Johnson, where they had brought in Perelman as a script doctor. And I wish I could quote it right, but he said something like, last night I was rushed by ambulance to the side of an ailing musical. Story was precious little, laughs there were none, and no heroic measures could be used to save the patient, something like that. Anyway, I should probably say that in addition to the audio book that I do all the reading and voices on, and the Kindle version, which are on Amazon, if someone would like to get a copy of the actual book and have me sign it or sign it to them, they can go to my website, Steve Stoliar, STOLIAR.com, and go to the shop and order a copy, and I'll be happy to sign it.
Is this show going to go up on your website like the others have?
I can. I'll put it on
I'll
YouTube.
probably get more views off of your website than of mine, so...
What the hell?
But
anyway...
Before you run, though, Steve, before you go, because we've done almost 2 hours, and there's so much of your book left, which is great because people now have to read the whole thing to see everything that happened.
See if a request pours in to have me back.
Well, I'm going to insist on it from people, so I don't know how much effect that'll have on anybody, but I'll try.
All right.
Before you go, though, soon to be a major motion picture, yes?
Seemingly, it has been a long and winding road, a phrase that Lennon and McCartney stole from me. But yes, my book has been optioned, actually has been purchased, which was very nice, is being developed as a film. I co-wrote the screenplay. We have a director and some of the cast. I can't talk names yet because it hasn't been announced. But they're very serious about doing this. It's not just one of a whole bunch of stuff that this company may want to or just write it off, or they really do want to do it. And the director...
They'd be insane not to want to do it. Well, you see, as I told you, we somehow lost the goodbyes to each other, but really, who cares? It was just two people saying goodbye. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Steve. I certainly did. Steve is a really smart, talented writer and a terrific guy. I've had a number of conversations with him since then, and I really believe Groucho Marx's sensibilities rubbed off on Steve. So there you go. I have two things I want to talk about before we leave for the day. One, COVID. It's not gone, folks. If anything, it's getting worse again. The reason it's getting worse again is because, as I said in last week's broadcast, we reopened everything too soon. And there are now 2 mutations going on, and stores are beginning to ask people to wear masks again. At least they are in the civilized world. So please take precautions, wear masks, social distance. It does not matter if you have been vaccinated, as I have and every member of my family has. You still need to be extremely careful. For those of us vaccinated, if you catch one of the variants, as my younger brother did, you may not die, which is a good thing, but it's not easy to get through. I was terrified listening to my brother while he was going through it. And he had been vaccinated, he was wearing a mask, and yet he still caught it. So do not believe anyone who tells you different. It's still out there, and you can still get it. The second part I want to bring up, or the second item I wanted to bring up, is Twitter. Yesterday, my sister-in-law, who is as sweet as pie, got into a bit of a tiff with a guy who turned out to be a Nazi and racist. And when I say Nazi, I'm not, what's the term I'm looking for? I am not exaggerating. This guy posted Nazi memes. He is incredibly anti-Semitic. He used the N-word. But here's the thing. When my sister-in-law and I and a number of other people we know messaged Twitter and said, hey, this guy is way out of line. You need to do something about him. They did absolutely nothing. Now, I have progressive friends who have had their accounts canceled, shut down, whatever, for saying nothing outrageous, nothing harmful to anyone, nothing inciting violence against others. Meanwhile, this Nazi is still up, and they told my sister-in-law in an email that they'd looked at his account and were not going to remove it. Well, if they'll remove progressives for basically saying nothing, and they'll leave an outright Nazi up, we have a serious problem, and something that people need to contact Twitter and deal with, because there's something really, really wrong. And I don't know what else to say about it. I was shocked that they let this guy get away with posting the anti-Semitic memes, the racist memes, it was just awful. So that's that. Otherwise, I'm going to give you now the same end pitch that I always give you. If you like the show, please share it with others. If you're listening to the podcast, subscribe. If you're watching on my YouTube channel or LinkedIn, please subscribe there too. And like it. We now have an Instagram page, The World According to Yoni, which you can follow. We are on Facebook as The World According to Yoni. And there's my personal page, According to Yoni, on Facebook. You can like me, you can follow me, you can do all the things that you do with social media. And I am also on Twitter as According to Yoni. So please like the show, follow the show, subscribe to the show. You would be doing me a great favor because I like to know that I actually have an audience that's watching and listening. I'm silly that way, I know, but what can you do? Anyway, that's what I have to say today. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Steve Stoliar. Next week, we're going to talk character actors with one of the best in the business, Stephen Tobolowsky. And if you don't know the name Stephen Tobolowsky, I promise you, you'll know the face. So look for that probably next Tuesday. And until then, please stay safe, stay sane, and don't take any shit from anyone. Bye-bye.